Joining us on the line is Marian Tupy, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, co-author of the fantastic new book, Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Marian, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So, Marian, one of the things that we've been told is that the world is overpopulated. We hit 8 billion people recently, that resources are running out, that the best thing that we can do for the future is to restrict resource use in artificial ways. And essentially, we should go to zero growth. That's the only way to save the planet. What do you make of those critiques?
Well, in 1800, there was 1 billion people in the world. Today, there is 8 billion people in the world. And yet the world is significantly richer than it was 200 years ago. Not only are we fabulously rich by historical standards, but we also live longer. Life expectancy used to be 25 to 30 years. Now, globally, it's 72. In the United States, 78. There are many other advances. Famine has basically disappeared from the world outside of war zone. So we live longer, we consume more food, we are richer. Don't forget that we are much more educated. 200 years ago, only a small fraction of the population was literate. So in many ways, the world has improved in spite of population growth, or as I would argue, because of population growth, because every baby that comes into the world doesn't come only with an empty stomach, but also with a pair of hands and, more importantly, with a brain capable of thinking and making the world a better place.
So, Marian, one of the things that you're constantly hearing also from our politicians is that the world has stagnated since 1980, that the middle class has disappeared. This is particularly true in Western countries. People cite this. They say that living standards have gotten worse, that basically there's been this mass stagnation, globalization, free trade. These things are bad because, after all, jobs are being shipped overseas. Well, what are the real facts about the living standards of people in the West compared to, say, 40 years ago?
Well, one of the ways that we try to answer this question was to look at the prices of finished goods that people can buy in the store today, as opposed to, let's say, in the late 1970s. And what we found that everything has become much cheaper for the same amount of work that would basically allow you to buy one vacuum cleaner back in the 1970s. Today you can get 6 instead of one. Instead of one man's suit, now you can get 3. So in many ways, things have become cheaper, or at least things have become cheaper in those areas where the free market is allowed to operate. So we have seen massive declines in the prices of food over the last 40 years, finished goods, electronics, toys, things like that. In those areas where the government is very heavily involved, primarily education, healthcare, and childcare, the prices have skyrocketed. So that tells us that abundance is really a choice. When we in the United States and other advanced economies choose to submit to the market forces and competition, we can create more wealth, we can create better standards of living. But when the government steps in and declares something to be a human right, it basically has the exact obverse effect, and things become much more scarce.
I'm talking with Marian Tupy, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, co-author of the new book, Superabundance. So, Marian, one of the things that I love about the book is that you actually attempt to measure human prosperity. And this is something that very few people do. They tend to use GDP as sort of the sole stat that they use. One of the things that you talk about, for example, is the time value that is invested in particular resources. So it's not just a question of production. It's also how much time you would have to have expended for a similar product, say, 100 years ago. So one of the most obvious examples is light. A couple hundred years ago, the amount of effort and number of hours you would have had to work in order to trade for, say, a candle is a lot higher. Today, essentially, light is just free. And these are the sorts of things that people don't think about.
Yeah, so 200 years ago, it would take you 4 hours of labor in order to buy 1 hour of reading light. Today, light is basically very often too cheap to measure. But in terms of what you are saying, yes, we measure prosperity with time. And we did that deliberately because we didn't want to use inflation measures. A lot of people around the world do not trust government statistics. Is the inflation 10%? Is it 8%? Is it the overall inflation, or is it just the core inflation? There is a lot of uncertainty about measuring stuff with inflation. However, if you measure things with time, time is a universal constant. Seconds and minutes don't change between 1850 or 1800 and 2000. An hour of work is the same in China or in India or in the United States. And most importantly, everybody has only 24 hours in a day. So what you do with your time is very important. And in the book, we measure everything in time prices. We ask, how long did it take you to earn enough money to buy, say, a bag of oranges or a pound of bananas in 1800 or 1900, and how much does it cost today? And if instead of an hour, you only have to work 30 minutes, that tells you you are twice as well off as you were before.
So, Marian, let's talk for a second about the proposed solutions to proposed problems. So the idea is that global warming is going to kill billions of people, certainly if not billions, hundreds of millions of people. There'll be mass migrations. The Earth will essentially turn into Mad Max thanks to global warming. And this is why we have to curb global growth, essentially. That zero growth is what we need to aim for. What do you make of that argument? Are we about to experience some sort of great global catastrophe via the climate? And if there is a problem, what exactly should we be doing about it so that we don't actually quash the only mechanism for human prosperity that we've ever known about, namely free markets and property rights?
The only way that you can assess whether there's an existential crisis, what does existential crisis from climate change mean? It means an existential crisis to our species, that some sort of a climactic change could result in wiping out our species. But how do you measure it? And the only way that you can measure it is by looking at how many people die every year from extreme weather events, be it droughts or floods or fires or volcanic eruptions and things like that. In the last 100 years, the number of people dying due to extreme weather have declined by 98 or even 99%. So that tells us that we are not facing an existential crisis. Yes, the world is slowly warming, but we can adapt to that. One of the big concerns of the extreme environmentalists is what is happening to sea rise levels. But look, Holland is 1/3 of the Netherlands is under the water table, under the water level. 200 years ago, at the time when the Dutch had a much more primitive technology and their GDP per capita was equivalent to Bangladesh, they were able to build these dikes to be able to dry out this land and prevent the sea from swallowing them. There is absolutely no technical reason why we couldn't do the same today. After all, the sea is rising by 1 foot per century, and that means that we have a lot of time in order to address these problems and many others. What is necessary is more knowledge and more wealth. And through more knowledge and more wealth, we can adapt to slightly rising global temperatures.
Well, that is Marian Tupy. His book is Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. It's a fantastic resource for those of us who actually are tethered to reality and understand that the world's gotten a lot better, materially speaking, over the course of the last couple of centuries. Marian, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Alrighty, folks, we reached the end of the show. We'll be back here next week with a lot more. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Give thanks to friends and family and mostly to God. I'm Ben Shapiro. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.